Hello, everyone. Welcome to Series 4 of the Public Interest Technology PIT Colloquium. We're delighted to be back with this new series and have an engaging program lined up. My name is Roba Abbas, and I am a senior lecturer in the School of Business at the University of Wollongong, Australia, and the Socio-Technical Systems Technical Committee Chair at the IEEE. I'm joined today by my co-host, Katina Michael, who is the Director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. Katina and I would like to acknowledge the work and support of Melissa Waite and the events team at the College of Global Futures at Arizona State University. As we enter into Series 4 of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium, I'd like to take a moment to reflect. We journeyed from Series 1, which focused on values, responsible innovation, and COVID-specific technological responses, to Series 2, which centered on storytelling, imagination, and participatory design methodologies, then to Series 3, which emphasized the global perspective with respect to the social, regulatory, and ethical considerations relevant to the design, the development, and delivery of technology in the public interest. In this series, we illuminate a path toward transdisciplinarity, hosting international speakers who will share with us their perspectives on experts and expertise, innovation ecosystems, multi-stakeholder approaches, and the opportunities and challenges relating to addressing complex societal challenges. It is a pleasure to be opening the 4th series of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium with a true transdisciplinary researcher, educator, and mentor, Professor Marcus Wigan. By way of introduction, Marcus Wigan is an active octogenarian Emeritus Professor of Edinburgh Napier University. Since 1963, Professor Wigan has worked on different aspects of information technology in a wide range of disciplines and is very sensitive to the broad range of social impacts that have developed over time and has done his best to anticipate these for many organizations, or as many organizations as possible, in the UK, the United States, and Australasia. Since retiring in 2007, Marcus has been a visiting, adjunct, or full honorary professor in a range of fields from engineering, ICT, social inquiry, and sustainable transport, variously at Imperial College London, the University of Melbourne, and other universities, and most recently an Honorary Fellow in the Conservatorium of Music at the University of Melbourne. His many formal qualifications range from an Oxford Doctor of Philosophy in Nuclear Physics to Masters in Applied Ethics, International Relations, and Musicology, among others, in addition to fellowships from Physics and Engineering to Transport, Higher Education, and ICT. He is also a senior member of the IEEE. Professor Wigan's experiences across these roles underpin his primary interest and engagement of multiple disciplines and fields with very different cultures and knowledge bases, and the creation of knowledge at their intersections. These, alongside his public sector policy and academic experience, inform today's topic, which is the role of expertise and experts in public service and policy. Welcome, Professor Marcus Wigan, to the Public Interest Technology Colloquium, and we're delighted to be hosting you today.
Well, there are a number of major trends that have been going on. They've all had major impacts on policy, or should have done, or will do. And it's worthwhile just listing them as a start. Climate change at last is understood by most people as actually occurring. It's been well known for nearly 50 years. Pandemics, I think everybody knows about that. Loss of trust in organizations. Not as many people are aware of this as they should be, but there have been consistent and repeated checks that there have been drops in confidence in not just government, but other organizations too. There is something a little uneasy in the underpinning of our society here, and we need to address it. Another point which has been overlooked by many people is that, irrespective of rude comments about the quality of much education, there's been an unmistakable and steady increase in the level of the community in terms of educational background, access to information. And generally, this level is one that's had very broad effects. The next is that the connections between people and organizations have become substantially weaker. Disintermediation is the term which is used when you want to use a four-syllable word. But what it really means is that if you want to get something done, you will be told after an indefinite time on the phone to go away and look at a website. Only with desperation will you actually get hold of a person. So that has not exactly assisted trust. It has increased efficiency, but the definition of efficiency varies depending on whether you're on the delivery end or the receipt end. Again, I'm linking this back to trust. Population aging. This has two effects. One is that the majority of the expertise in the community is probably now in a group that most people would regard as elderly or aged, 50 plus. That's where most of the knowledge and expertise is. That's not the perception of the community. However, population aging is unavoidable, continuing, and broadly based, and carries with it a number of stereotypes, and again, different levels of trust. The rise and penetration of social media is something that doesn't really need anything more than being listed. It's both enormous benefit and an enormous danger. Like anything with a lot of potential, you get both. At the same time, we've had a marked reduction in global stability. The perception of the future is not positive for many people. One might even say for most people. Reductions in public service staffing. I'll come to that in a minute because this has a quite strong effect. But in general, there have been reductions, partly because computer disintermediation has helped, and partly because of political moves, and partly because of cultural shifts in the expectations of public service. That I'll come back to. The most worrying aspect is that instead of public service being, if you like, the third pole on which a society rests, it's become politicized and become part of the second pole. This hasn't helped trust very much. So let's discuss the theme, which is expertise. We all know what expertise is, don't we? Yes, I'm not sure we're going to get the same answer from any two people. In fact, we're unlikely to get the same answer from the same person in two different situations. It is, however, something that contains power and leverage. Experts. What are experts? Once upon a time, it was somebody who had a degree. Now, the degree is not necessarily a reliable indicator. What's the role of public service? Well, this has changed substantially in the eyes of many people. For many, it has been doing what the people in power tell them to do. But if you actually read the Act, and I'm only talking about the Australian Act, there is a responsibility to the community as well as to the politicians. There we see the first underpinning of the word expertise. The capacity to do so is one that has been downplayed substantially and is now increasingly necessary. So those roles are now crucial. And of course, what's policy? Policy is seen very differently by the different players. And the third, if you like, the third rail is the political advisors, of which several hundred may appear in service of a single politician, hasn't actually helped the visibility, credibility, and trust in the public service. In fact, some of the actions has been seen to have undermined what would otherwise have been pretty sound advice. None of this looks terribly important until you look at the practical impacts and the cultures of each of the players. Well, now we have the public service, the politicians, and the political advisors. That last one wasn't a player for a long time. Now it is. So, who makes the decisions? Who frames the policies? Well, increasingly, you find yourself looking at political advisors as having a disproportionate influence. Now, what expertise do they have? It's highly unlikely. Let us consider defense for a minute, because that's a really critical one. We know that a collection of people who probably don't exceed 30, with primarily legal and other backgrounds and political science, took major decisions on the F-35 decisions. When you put it like that, it sounds as if something's missing. Maybe they do have the political expertise. But that's not the only thing you need. You need everything from logistics to defense to strategy. You need a lot of serious, in-depth specialities, which used to be the place that the public service hosted. Public service is now very slim comparatively, certainly at the senior levels. And it is difficult to think of any area of public policy which doesn't draw upon multiple disciplines and good judgment in most of them. How many organizations do you know where multiple specialities are actually welcomed? I mean, outside engineering, which is quite good at it. So we now have this phrase, transdisciplinarity. Transdisciplinarity is primarily a way of saying, look, we recognize that there are levels of expertise that we can't judge and we need. That's not a statement you'll hear from too many people, however much it's needed. Let's give a tiny little example, because it all sounds very broad and arm-waving. So let's take a little simple example. A little government unit set up to brief a minister solely on the safety aspects and policies for motorcycles. A nice, simple, narrow specification, lots of public support, for doing it, etc. Said unit has no apparent access to anything to do with mobility, to mode choice, demand, capacity, or any other aspect than pure safety. Fine, that's what the minister wants. So in the community, there's more than one, with exactly those skills over several continents, many years of refereed publications, policy input, offers to fill some of those gaps on a pro bono basis. The response was amusing or worrying, depending upon where you sat. The response was, it is insulting that there be asserted that there be any such gaps from the basis of 4 years of experience in this safety-only group. And that was the sole response. And if you find this hard to believe, I can document it, unfortunately. Now, the questions that this raises is this cultural? Is it professional narrowness? Is it myopia? Is it political direction? Is it a judgment that there can be no such expertise? Is it a perception of scope in dealing with that particular mode? those questions immediately arise and no answers are forthcoming. So there is at least one tiny little example here where it's perfectly evident that a little broader range of disciplines is essential and not even perceived to exist. So what is expertise? Let's take another area. Freight systems and logistics have become absolutely critical. We've all learnt that during the pandemic. I've personally built a multimodal GIS animation federated database for the eastern states of the EU and the FTA, and run freight policy for Greater London and for the UK port strategy. I thought I might be able to help a little bit when they wanted to build a freight hub. Had a brief meeting in Canberra. Canberra is where the public servants go to, I don't know quite what the phrase is, but I suppose the word is breed, isn't it? I mean, they sort of multiply. I had a brief meeting, no names were exchanged, no cards, and it was all too painfully obvious that no understanding of the tasks that we were discussing was held by the senior executive or the party there to advise. They literally didn't know, and zero follow-up. Now, whether or not that was an appropriate decision is now a painful question. If the capacity to judge is not available, how do you judge expertise? That's not a theoretical question. It is now a question that arises in many areas of government and in policy development. Because if that is the way in which the support for policy development is provided, there are huge gaps. And even more, huge resources that are not being used in the community, which is sad. If you now look at this, you can see that you really need to think more carefully about how government is operated. Not just how they develop the policies, but how they implement them. Now, why do we have so many major problems in these disintermediation exercises? Australian listeners will know about a robo-debt, which was an automated penalty generation system, which unfortunately led to $1.8 billion of recompense to the people who had been handled by this rather poorly designed system. The real question is, of course, why did it get that far? Which expertise levels and what type of experts were perceived as appropriate in order to judge it or carry out tests or assess its utilization? Which brings me back to the top line. We need more co-design of government, particularly digital government, because by the time it arrives, there are millions of people involved, and we could do a lot better. So why is it not happening? It's not happening for a number of reasons, and I'll give you just one Australian one. The public service is split amongst federal and state. The federal has very broad impacts, and I'll focus on the federal. At one time, the federal public service had strong state representations of professionals. Professional contact occurred casually. Joint work appeared between researchers, policy people, etc. I remember doing one myself, which just came out of a casual conversation. This has gone completely. It's vanished. So the span of connections has been diminished at the same time as the community has become more expert. This is not a healthy situation for trust. Now, public sector governance that can re-engage trust is something that ironically has just been taken up by the new government in Australia as a serious need. The second point is one that other countries learnt long ago. Increased permeability of public service will be needed, because otherwise the connections between different disciplines and different levels of expertise will not occur. It worked quite well in Britain when it started. This also requires a rethinking and a breakdown of linear career acquisition of skills and cultures. How many people do you know who are in the same discipline now as they started? And if they are, should they be? Because change has gone through every discipline and the way that they relate to others. None of this is impossible, but it's not framed as a need. Why have we got such a problem with policy and identification of expertise? There is an underpinning, and an underpinning point is a trend that swept across the world in the 1990s. And it could be summarized as steering, not rowing. Namely, public services and policy development areas got spun out. And the role of the public service was basically to let contracts. At least that's what it turned into. Now, if you do that, there is another subtle shift which has destroyed trust at a remarkable rate. Have you noticed that most phrases now are community engagement, not community consultation? Why is this? It is because the formulation of the policy or the contract is done. So what you have to do is to get the community, the great unwashed, on board. Consultation means that they may have some power, and this is the critical phrase, they may indeed have expertise that could challenge the people you're contracting out to. Not a welcome comment. Let's ask a simple question. Are the people that you deal with in the policy area letting contracts to the big four seriously capable of judging the outcome in the technical form that it's delivered? If they were, some of the disasters like Robodebt would not have occurred. Now, if you do it, if you break this down, there's very limited capacity to undertake any co-design. Co-design is now more possible than it has ever been. The levels of education are much higher, and people don't really want to recognize it. Once again, expertise resides with who? With those you choose to rate as having that. The inability to judge the community expertise is the really sad thing. If they could judge it, then they could use it. If they don't have some background, they can't judge it. This is one of the soft underbellies. Unfortunately, this seems to apply even in their own professional domain in cases in which I've certainly observed personally. I don't know how broad it is, but it's certainly one I've seen. Now, there are many governance barriers to utilizing the expanded community skills, so we need to think about ways of doing that a lot better. And that means that policy formation and the expertise that's drawn to it would have a much broader base, very much more difficult to manage, but one that we now need to do. Of course, the political barriers to more open means of policy development are blindingly obvious. Policy formation is where power resides. All one can do is to say, look, here it is. This is the toxic legacy of the steering, not rowing syndrome. What happened initially was that lots of highly capable people were externalized from not just public services, but from many major companies. And contracts were let. For quite a long time, this worked. Why? Because the people who remained there in command had at least had some exposure to the underpinnings and technical requirements of their own disciplines. When that faded away, we now see the situation where judgment of expertise, either in the community or elsewhere, has been converted to selecting the right brand. McKinsey's, you know the list. Now that cycle started in the 90s. Highly technical external, internal skills were externalized quite broadly, and it isn't just in government. The next generation had the backgrounds, but the next did not. So they outsourced. And there you can see the sharp point of where problems in judging the expertise started. So they bought brands instead. Were they capable of judging what they got? Well, the evidence appears that not always. And perhaps, unless action is taken, progressively less. In fact, it's already got to the stage where they now have to get the Big Four to write policies for them. And there are too many examples for comfort. So let's go back to the political advisors, because who are the experts? They've grown a great deal. The bending of public service staff to politicize goals has undermined the rest. From my personal contacts, I can say that the lower levels of the public service are as competent, energetic, and excellent as they have always been. But the rot has dropped a long way down from the top. And this is where it has to change. I have noticed that the current new government in Australia has taken some action to do that. Unfortunately, the moment the power and the policy power moves to the consultants, guess where politicians go when they get externalized from their own profession? Doesn't exactly increase the efficiency of expenditure, and it certainly does not increase the confidence of the community. So the judgment of expertise from the community, which is not the way around it is normally looked, has progressively decayed for these reasons. And the trust has sunk with it. If it sinks a great deal more, then we know from sociology that disturbances in the community and governance can occur. So it's not something that we can say, oh dear, well, you know, they don't know any better. The problem is that the original roles of public service, which was to generate policy, to contest, to advise, to produce, has now migrated to lobby groups who can afford to hire some very good people and produce policies which would not necessarily be regarded as entirely independent. And I call it the Orestes effect for all of those who have read and enjoyed Orestes' marvelous analysis of how lobby groups in climate and tobacco, etc., have worked. These are now major groups. Do they have expertise? They certainly have some experts, but do they have the expertise that we would wish them to have? Who judges them? Now, what happens to the other side of the fence, the government side? Increased secrecy. The standard phrase you get if you want to look at, say, the underpinnings of a transport model is commercial in confidence, politically sensitive, rapid shutdowns of freedom of information. I'll give you an example. I think it's going to be around $20 billion investment, Northeast Link. I talked to the person who audited the analyses, who admitted to me he hadn't been allowed to see the models. He had to work on the published documents. I think it would be difficult to find a more devastating commentary. So where was the expertise? The university was brought in to provide branding of an audit, but not the substance. So the credibility of government policies shrinks, trust declines, capacity of community to judge increases, trust in both civil service and government falls. This is why we have to worry about who is perceived as experts, who is perceived as holding expertise, and who is permitted to exercise it. Unfortunately, we're dealing with a situation where disintermediation of all organizations and their users has accelerated through COVID at a remarkable rate. I don't know how many of you have used a chatbot and wondered why it wouldn't help you after it had managed to get your name, address, rank, and serial number. Perhaps because that was what they actually wanted. I don't think that's a theory either. Excellent way of expanding your mailing base. That disintermediation can be exploited in both directions. Doesn't enhance trust. The complexity that we're dealing with is substantial. Governments are struggling with it, but it's rarely assessed from a user stance. The user is represented by a lobby group. At least that is what the press decides to do. We don't have the mechanisms to do it any better yet. Unfortunately, the development of Graham Greenleaf to get the entire Australian Acts in public access online, they still need expert legal interpretation. So how do we make this complexity accessible to the expertise which resides in the community? One of the answers is, of course, regulations as code and approaches of that type, which is not the way that they are normally developed. They are not the way they're tested. It is not the way that the community is allowed to engage with it. Notice allowed. So we have structural possibilities which have been enabled by information technology that would be really, really valuable. And if you looked at those three and they were addressed a little bit more energetically, it's highly likely that trust would increase. And with the trust, the ability to identify expertise and experts would increase as well. So the next part, I'd like to talk about what can we do. But for that, I'm going to hand over to Roba, because I've introduced the various points and themes. And now I'd like to look at it from a different set of angles.
Thank you so much, Professor Wigan, for your excellent presentation and for setting the scene for us and really speaking to the underpinning trends, definitions of expertise, public service and policy, and so much more. So to the cultural, professional and other tensions that exist. Marcus, you spoke about the ensuing divides, the gaps, inability to make the most of community resources. And I think those examples that you provided us with really reinforce the significance of multiple specialty perspectives, inclusive of community, not engagement, but consultation and co-design, and how we might go about judging expertise, community expertise and the governance barriers, and so much more that I can reflect on. And we will have the opportunity for questions and detailed reflections in a moment in relation to your talk. But given that you've set this scene for us, Marcus, I would like to invite you to share your thoughts on what we can do about some of the challenges you identified, what your thoughts are, a suitable path forward toward that change that you spoke about, and perhaps we can then come in with additional reflections and discussions and engagement as you do so.
Thank you, Roba. We quite often look at things in various ways. If we're listening to a presentation, we're listening to a presentation. But if we're actually asked, okay, here's a situation which you probably recognize some parts of, but maybe not others. But what could you do about it? So I thought it would be appropriate to cover a few points from the point of view of we. Anyway, who is we? Is we the ITC industry? Well, they're a critical element. And one of the things they need is better ethics and the power to kick back at what they're asked to do. Whistleblowers, etc. I can say I put my hand up and did do something of this kind with the Australian Computer Society. If anybody's interested, there is a paper in the Australian Journal of Information Science on the ethic issues. But it needed a shift for the individuals to be defended instead of the organizations who employed them. Because who can see these subcontracted pieces of work? The people who are implementing the code. They'll produce it. Who's going to judge it? Well, quite a lot of people in the ITC industries are pretty good at that. They need to be empowered more. The second is the law is a difficult environment to deal with, and it has its own cultures. But rules as code, as a way of developing it, means that when you have policies being implemented, there are better, or at least different, frames of reference that can be used to ensure that there's broader understanding as to what is implied. And hopefully, that can get greater trust in the legal outcomes. This is not new. I mean, I remember writing a paper in the 80s on formal specifications of planning rules, environment and planning. The interesting thing is, it's now being cited. What is it? 40 years later? It doesn't mean to say we didn't know. It means that it hasn't seemed relevant, and now it does. Now, the different cultures that we've got the legal culture, we've got the ITC culture, we've got the HR and governance culture, all of which are interacting with how expertise are marshaled and how policy is framed and tested. What's stopping us doing more constructive things? Well, part of it is perceptions and specifications of roles. Unless people are enabled within power structures to be able to engage, they're not all that likely to do so. So the perceptions of responsiveness and the specifications of roles in both public service and policy formation and testing, the perception that it is possible to get a change is something that we really need to enhance. And we can. There's now plentiful community expertise. It's really quite remarkable. If you actually go out into your own community and have a good look, you'll find within a small span of space a quite remarkable degree of highly developed competence, much with international perception and expertise and experience that could be drawn upon. We don't know how to do this, and we're not doing it, but we could do it. The problem is that the tool for productivity is information technology and communications. I say ITC, I always have. I've never said IT, I've always said ITC, because IT grows legs, arms, and energy when it has the communication underpinning. But the disintermediation is proving very negative for a large fraction of the population. Not just because they don't particularly get on with information technology, but because much of it is implemented very badly. Here are some of them. Complex conditions are assumed to be understood. This is perfectly normal. If you're a specialist, all the obvious things you don't bother to explain because, of course, they're obvious. Unfortunately, this does not always transfer to other disciplines and to other people with other backgrounds. So, the available information requests are often very hard to get to, let alone to get an answer to. We now have major lobby groups developing navigators to try to use this disintermediation. Aged care is a classic case where there are a lot of aged care navigators to just try to go through the system. The same will apply if you go to any other field, except that they haven't got navigators. But trust sinks every time, and the reputation of the organization and of government in particular goes with it. This is not a small issue, this is a really big one. So let's take another angle. Let's say that you're running an organization, and let's explore what you've got. How would you rate your overall staff expertise? Lots of good people, okay, red hot. What proportion would you say are really top of their field in their area of responsibility? Few? All? What proportion do you think is the right balance for your workforce? Notice permanent workforce. How often do you need additional expertise or skills or experts? How do they seek it out, or do they? How do you ensure a multidisciplinary approach to your projects? And how often do you do this? How often do you see the need to do so? How often do you check your customers, or the people who are actually going to get customers, of the term we all have to use now, as part of this? And what percentage of day-to-day decisions do you make rather than your team? Because in a multiple expert team, a lot of decisions are distributed. How often do you raise new ideas from your team up the leadership chain in your organization? Occasionally, always, never? And what is the biggest challenge for each of your staff to apply the specialist expertise that most of them have in your organization? That's a slightly different way of looking at it, instead of saying, what is your job specification? I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm saying it does provide you with a focus on how you're using your specialist expertise. Now, consider yourself in a position where you're having to get most of your work done by contract, including writing policy. What areas of expertise are you personally confident in judging? And how confident are you that you are aware of all relevant items? How do you assess proposals? Internal structure, confirmation by relevant experts, and are you one of them? Or do you rate yourself as one of them? Political acceptability? Which lobby groups? What social network support do you get? As you notice, experts are only one of 5. From outside the fence, you and I, in our personal capacities, what confidence do you have is that the evidence provided was understood, if any? How do you judge it? Do you ever get any feedback? If your group has high-level expertise, is this judged as relevant? Or is it assumed to be irrelevant? And on what basis? Are there channels where you can deal with similar levels of competence? Generally, in policy areas, no. So, how do you get attention? And how do you assess the response when you get it? And if it appears to lack knowledge, judgment, and expertise, what on earth can you do about it? And if the latter happens repeatedly, does it reduce trust in government? It would be very surprising if it did not. And these are precisely the questions that I hear from the community. Now, looking outwards for engagement, we've got known unknowns, people you know you miss. unknown unknowns, people you don't know that you miss. And for people, read levels of expertise, resources, knowledge, experience. People is simply a code for that. Citizen juries provide you with face validity, and they do expand the basis, but how wide can you manage? And if you get too much, what can you do with it? And what expectations are you generating when you do it to start with? Now, the networks of staff are your key perspective sensors when you're looking out. Spatial, where are they based? What networks, which cities, whatever. Virtual, we now all rely on virtual to a very large extent, but they're not quite as easy to build new networks that way. And cultural. The cultural will generally dominate the networks that you build, unless you make an effort to do otherwise. And to go back to the lovely Norbert Wiener idea of, do they provide requisite variety for the situation you're dealing with? And do you know? Now, let's say you're successful. Let's say you get a lot of diverse perspectives, or as might otherwise be put it, insufficiently focused. Now, at the start, it can be helpful in the span that's considered, but it can also diffuse available effort resources. At the end, it picks up target responses and can stimulate rethinking, not a common situation. If the whole process is contracted out, large chunks of learning are lost before delivery and you never get it. The onus is on the contractor to judge the final quality and relevance, which is your job. So there are cumulative losses of both capacity and control, and one might add credibility. If we're going to take a transdisciplinary approach, which is the essential point of view I was asked to take, ensuring diversity at the start is definitely prudent. Conserving the learning in the process is absolutely essential because it's very expensive to get. And cycle through the target area before finalization. You know, however well you do the specification, customers may not see it the way that you thought you had designed it. And retain sufficient skills internally to be able to judge outcomes, to be able to identify and articulate wider and relevant groups, and to be able to respond to needs for change or revision. If these sorts of tests are applied to policy development, you can't do them all, but even a few of them would enhance trust. And without trust, policy development doesn't really work. Unfortunately, why did e-democracy fail? Because one would have thought that would have been ideal. Governments were a little reluctant to engage with a community, at least as expert as their staff was, and particularly if it's more expert. Have any of you been involved in a citizen jury where the members of the jury knew more than the people who were running it? I certainly have. It's a very interesting experience to observe how it's handled. Not always accepted. There are assumptions too about the learning rates of interaction, and they're quite ill-founded. When you brief community groups, you assume you know what they need to know. I've seen that happen too. So you don't get the input that you need. Citizen reference groups become strongly directed and basically adopted. And on every occasion I've observed them, they've been constrained in the scope of the responses permitted, which is not exactly the idea of trying to get broader and wider based expertise involved. But here are a few rules of thumb. Ensure the diversity is at the start. Conserve the learning in process and cycle through the target area before finalization so that what you see is what the customers see. And retain sufficient internal skills to be able to judge the outcomes, to be able to identify and articulate wider groups that you now need, and to be able to respond to needs for change or division. And perhaps one might underline, make it possible to have such a capacity to respond. I'm afraid this is not behaving the way I'd like. Right. So now we have experts, rarely involved, trust and respect dropped as a result of such citizen engagements. Notice the word consultation does not appear. How do we know this is quite widespread? The rapid growth of fact and assertion checkers, usually from universities, who still retain some independent expert status. But one has to ask, for how long? And I don't know how long. I take it over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Marcus Wigan, for an enlightening discussion, presentation with so many thoughts swirling through my head, and I'm sure the heads of our attendees as well. I will hand over to Professor Katina Michael for some immediate reflections. We also have some reflections in the chat for you, which I'll invite individuals to unmute if they wish to share them. Otherwise, I can read them. For those of you attending live, please feel free to pop any other questions, reflections, and thoughts in the chat in relation to this presentation, to transdisciplinarity in general, and we'll get to those comments in a moment. But over to you, Katina.
Thank you, Roba, and thank you, Marcus, for that wonderful elucidation, taking us on an incredible journey with you, an incredible career, an incredible contribution as well, informing your presentation. You've been working with our team for close to 17 years now, and supported us in so many different aspects, from transportation to location-based services, privacy, and so much more. We're so appreciative of all of that. Today in the audience, Marcus, are some amazing minds that have been catapulted into several particular subjects and courses at ASU in particular. I want to give a shout out to the students who have come from their PhDs. They've been in classes all day and have come to hear you talk on short notice, because they are in such a class, such a diverse setting at the moment. We've got students from healthcare, from management, from computer engineering, from computer science, robotics, big data systems, global technology and development, design environment and the arts from the Herberger Institute, public service and public policy, machine learning and computer engineering, if I didn't mention it, and so many other discipline areas. And we're studying smart city infrastructure and technology, and we're trying to zoom into a particular societal problem. And you listed so many on your first opening slide, which was wonderful to see. This reminder that societal problems can be addressed by communities, by the public service, by government. You also identified for us all those different stakeholder types. You mentioned government agencies, consulting companies, technology companies. You mentioned NGOs and the potential for lobbying and advocacy, sometimes warranted, sometimes not wanted, perhaps. The media, the role of citizens, the role of communities, the lived experience and lived expertise, something that Dr. Abbas reminded me of about a year ago, this importance of differentiating between the lived experience and lived expertise. But I come back to this notion of trust that you've emphasized, and I just wanted to say, accountability comes to mind when you talk about all of the things that you have. That's my very short reflection. I'd like to hand back to Roba to go to the next phase.
Thank you so much, Katina. We do have, Marcus, some reflections and questions in the chat. I might take one of those questions from Deva. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The question is, if a lack of technical understanding or access to information is already evident in the public service, what do you think will happen with rapid progress in machine learning, where AI programs make it possible that the ICT will not fully understand decision-making inputs that comprise public purpose tools?
It's a very pertinent question. Because in order to get productivity, we need to do as much learning as we can, and we don't have enough people to do it. So reducing experience to judgment, which is what machine learning purports to do, has raised, I think, more groups dealing with AI ethics than I can imagine in dealing with philosophy in the average university. And the reason is because people don't know how to do it. That in fact, a large amount of machine learning provides a wonderful reproduction of the worst aspects of our practical community. And we haven't figured out how to distinguish between what is a sadly accurate summary of the behaviors that we've been analyzing and what are highly effective ones. And these are coming up from many, many, many different angles. I think that's a healthy development. One of the things that I found most striking is the House of Lords in the UK started an inquiry, and I was privileged to be party to talking to the people who were starting it, because I had a friend who was in the Lords who was at university with me. And I became very keen to see what they produced, because they had a remarkably practical view. The net result was they recommended an organization that could actually mediate this stuff. So the government had to take some responsibility for it, which is one of the things we have to do. So if we have people who are doing policy analysis and doing data reduction using machine learning, and they don't understand the constraints of what they're doing, and if they don't have the capacity to test the reliability of what they're getting, and if they don't see it as part of their role to do that, then we're going to have increasing problems. The robo-debt disaster was due to a simple averaging algorithm, which was never checked because it was implemented as specified, and the inquiry is going to show that. It wasn't their job to do it. They did what they were asked. That's exactly the same situation as most machine learning applications. There's no difference. They're doing what they're asked. But we don't understand what the underpinnings are. I haven't seen very many robustness analyses and things of that kind that one would do in order to do a process validation of an AI application. The process approach can be used, and robustness can also be used. But when it has been, that's when some of the racial biases have come out, because people have actually had a look. We don't have the skills yet to develop what one might call a calibration process, calibration assessment for machine learning. We certainly do not have a validation process for machine learning. And if people would distinguish between calibration and validation, then calibration means there is no, there's no ego involved in, saying it works like this or like that, or it's this reliable. But validation says this is telling us something. This has got some embedded understanding. This is a decision. This is a decision that has some backing. Those types of thoughts, they will appear, and they do appear, but very few of them appear in the same critique. There's just usually one point of view or another. And we don't have enough confidence in machine learning outcomes and how they're tested yet to be able to transmit this confidence to the community. I mean, if you think that that's a question, just count the number of AI ethics papers that you've seen released in the last week. I mean, you don't have to even make it a month. That's basically, I think, that would be my response to that very useful question.
It's a very useful question and such rich thoughts, and your response, I think, Marcus, talks to another question we have in the chat about AI bias, and we do have a follow-on question from Kricheka on humans are inherently biased, and this is already led to bias AI machine learning models, as you've already pointed out in your presentation. And as you pointed out, transdisciplinary research is the need of society. So how can we prevent biases in these transdisciplinary solutions when there is engagement from multiple disciplines?
I'm going to take a different view of this one. I'm going to say humans are inherently biased, and we celebrate it. We call it judgment. The problem is we don't know how to judge the judgment delivered by machine learning. That's the fundamental point. If we have somebody who's look, you want bias in many cases, but you need to know that you've got it. The problem, I think, is that when you don't know you've got it, it's the known unknown and the unknown knowns. That if you've got a machine learning that works really well and it reproduces this stuff and it's nasty to exactly the right people, why would you not cheer? What's this about even-handedness? I mean, for heaven's sake, we're trying to get something practical done. I'm sure we can all replicate those discussions without any effort whatever. Machine learning is a summarized way of doing what we do. So we're not really criticizing how we do very well. So unless you get a number of different perspectives applied to what you've got for your machine learning, you're going to get a replication of what you expect. And you can't help it, because after all, we do this. I know that's not quite the answer that you'd like, but the reality is that's what goes on. There is one other difficulty, that when you have a range of people in a room or in a group, you generally get rather better answers, especially if they come from different angles. Machine learning comes from one angle. It comes from replication of the test data. So in principle, it can't do as well as a group of people could with different backgrounds. And if you start from that point of view, then you have a chance of getting some sense out of ML learnings. But people don't do that. They say, oh, we didn't pick the right data, which is true. All such statements are true. But the difficulty is it's only a single decision framework. That's it. Is that good enough? All the computer scientists out there, one single dimension makes life easy, doesn't it?
Yeah, I agree to that.
But have you noticed that the customers are not that happy about it?
No, they never are.
Well, I thought it was a good question.
Thank you.
That was a great question indeed. Marcus, do you have any further thoughts? I'm not sure if I jumped in there.
Well, I do have further thoughts of that, but the fundamental ones are the ones that I wanted to make. That in fact, the frame of reference that we're using for judging AI. I mean, I've been looking at a lot of ethics in AI issues. I mean, I did some specialist study in ethics for some time, quite recently. And one of the questions I had to ask myself, which I ended up by writing a mini thesis on, was, does virtue ethics have anything to offer in mass data? And the answer is it bloody well better. But that isn't quite what I wrote. It is what I meant. But those frames of reference are not used. And the reason why is because most of the, what we should call practical altruism, says I, picking a particular target, is relativist. And once you've started down a relativist path, you do not have a virtue framework. End of story. So if you draw a diagram, you have relativism and you have absolutism. And if you have absolutism and virtue frameworks, you have one set of discussions. And if you have the others, well, it's only a question of how bad it is and whether you can put up with it, isn't it? So that's the distinction that I would add. And that's the only distinction I think that would be useful.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I might go to Stephen, who's been patiently waiting with a really great question in the chat, but I think he'll be talking to his question. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I should say how long Marcus and I have known each other, but I thought I would problematize the statement around juries and maybe bring in Roger's comments that he's been making in the chat about the dodging and weaving that public servants do to avoid true consultation. And what I'm problematizing is this notion that it's simple to choose who has credibility in their expertise. And this notion that somehow you send a CV or an application or you have a conversation and then everyone's like, oh, of course, you're the expert, we should pay attention to you or give weight to your opinion or whatever. What we have instead is a world that's awash with information where you're getting thousands of applications for every job at major organizations, and bureaucrats of all stripes being forced to choose who to listen to and how to weight opinions. And so often they economize on those decisions and fall back on what's easy, which is pedigree. Where did you get your degree? What corporation have you worked for? What level of government? What's your public service rank? Something like that is to determine who to pay attention to. So I think this notion that we can somehow have an ideal speech situation where we will naturally hear the best voices and they will come to the fore, I think is problematic given this need to economize.
Well, I entirely agree, Steve. I mean, the basic point is that if you get diversity in the room when you're having a debate, you generally get a better answer. So this is the reason why in those slides I put in the critical degree of diversity that you can handle. Because
but
that's
even
fundamental
choosing
work.
that diversity is a choice itself. You know, you still have to choose who's the most diverse group to have in the room. It's still a choice.
I did say that, didn't I? How much diversity can you afford? But we get better answers when we have diversity. The difficulties are of judgment of areas of expertise is extremely difficult. I'm going to make an apparent side look. I had a look because I've been around for rather longer than perhaps, well, 81 years to be exact. So I thought, since Google only shows publications back to 1981, they miss at least 10 or 15 years of my publications. So I thought I'd have a look and see how many of them were still being cited, how long afterwards. Well, I found quite a few 40 years later, and an increasing number 30 years later. Now, whilst I'm not suggesting this is a substitute, what I'm saying is that the framework of expertise that I prefer to use is good judgment. One of the ways of testing good judgment is the anticipation rate of issues that are relevant. So whilst it's only a small answer, it's just one that hasn't really been tested. And I had a little go at that. And publish or perish now includes span, is what I call it, because when I talked to her and said, I thought this might be useful, she said, yeah, sure. So she put it in. Now, we have not really thought very hard about these things. We've all done reviews of project proposals and things of that kind. And in some cases, we know that individuals put on there because of the power of the name are actually power abusers who have put their names on papers they didn't actually write and things of that kind. That kind of knowledge is stuff that doesn't actually appear on paper anywhere, but it certainly appears in the pluses and minuses in the reviews. Now, unless you have interaction, you can't have that. That's the second point that I was making earlier on, that reducing the span of interaction spatially reduces the capacity to make this judgment, reduces it, the increase virtually as the potential to increase it. The efforts to move outside the culture is another opportunity. But I actually think this is an issue that's well worth some serious research, because it's critically important. We don't know how to judge expertise, full stop. And what I've said are a number of things that says duration, spatial span, but we haven't even got a single study I can find, because I had a look before this talk, which actually looks at this. So why don't we go and do it? Because it's become important. Trust matters. We have some mechanisms that we can use, but transparency, accountability is one thing, which Laba raised. I actually think transparency is more powerful. The Northeast Link study, $20 billion, is a fair amount of change, even in American terms. And it hasn't been looked at by anybody who knows anything about transport modeling at all. I don't think it'll be identifiable. I know of a set of papers published in the Lancet, which based on transport planning models, which I know the models were flaky. They got 180% capacity on one major freeway, for example, hadn't been properly calibrated. But the people using them in the planning and medical areas didn't know how to ask the questions and didn't think of asking an expert in it to have a look. And these types of spreads across disciplines only occur if you have the personal connections, because it's this kind of loss of power. You say, I'm not sure I can do this. So, unless you've got some confidence, you're not likely to ring up some heavy to comment on the stuff for you. People are people, whatever you think. They're going to stay people. But I think the question of how you establish expertise in practical and specific ways is now a subject of transdisciplinary research that needs to be done yesterday. You'll notice the title of my talk was precisely targeted at that area.
You both mentioned some really important things, but one thing that resonated with me, Marcus, and talking to Roger's points, Roger's got some excellent, Roger Clark, some excellent reflections in the chat, which I will see if we can read out or hand over to Roger in a moment. But something that resonated with me is one point around community engagement, not community consultation, where you rightly mentioned consultation implies power and potential expertise that resides in the community, and talking to your points just now about how we judge expertise. You mentioned on a few occasions in your response to Stephen the concept of power, and I just wanted to focus on that for a moment before handing over to Roger and addressing his questions and reflections. So you've spoken to me at least, and certainly in your work, about power in the past, and you mentioned a concept not within the context of this talk but in a previous session about power leveling, and I was wondering if you can elaborate on this concept, how it relates to your response to Stephen, and also to transdisciplinarity, and why power leveling is a necessary exercise, or maybe a necessary exercise.
It's a cultural issue. I have no objections to any of you jumping on there if you can find a place to jump, because usually it produces a better understanding. But that's a cultural response. It is not a common cultural response. And I think we have to recognize that the psychology of people who have invested in power, and whether they realize they've invested in power or not is another matter. If it's challenged, then you get responses that are not necessarily very constructive. The reason that I use the spatial, virtual, cultural distinctions for keeping people looking outbound is because that lowers the barriers to the undertaking those steps. Whenever I've lectured on policy, I've gone to considerable lengths to reduce the power distance between any visitor that I might have with, heavy reputations. And we did it pretty successfully. I remember one extremely powerful and very strong individual saying at the end of a long evening, more CEOs should go through this. Do you want me next year? And that's a response which I suspect was probably the only time he ever made it. How do we reduce the barriers between levels of expertise? Well, that is not trivial, because my observation is that academia, in most cases, now is a series of territories, which is another way of talking about barriers and power. And the difficulty is that because particularly the dependence on grants have produced this, we now have a culture of barriers. The places where you go to actually think, there's a perimeter institute. Some of it's been funded to sit there and bloody well think hard. Find me a university where I can go to do that. Where? And it's our own fault, because we set those rules. We produce a multidisciplinary project, and the moment we've all put it together, as soon as the funds come through, we grab our money and we go away and hide. Please tell me an exception. There must be one somewhere, but I don't think there are very many. So what we have to do is to call out what is happening. Remember I closed on requisite variety? Have a look at Norbert Wiener's cybernetics. What is requisite variety? We don't have it anymore. That was the reason I closed on it. But it's up to us to formulate that and show what the benefits are of dealing with it. And we can. We know that having diverse groups together working on a single problem produces better answers. I mean, psychology has shown that to us so often. But it's not part of governance culture. It's not part of government culture. And I'm sad to say it seems to be slipping away from university culture.
Welcome, Professor Roger Clark.
G'day, Robert. G'day, Marcus. Great stuff. G'day, Steve. Yes, I've tossed a few things in here because you've touched so many parts of my experience, Marcus, because I sit astride the consultancy, academe, but also public advocacy arena. So I've lived and breathed so many of these things you've been describing. To pick up perhaps on one of the last little themes that's just been going on, the stakeholder analysis area. I've only just posted that comment just in the last minute or two. The stakeholder analysis theory, mainly in business schools, right, Steve, recognises that stakeholders have varying degrees of power, also of legitimacy and also of urgency. Each of those have definitions, obviously, in that body of theory. In my experience in government across all sides here in Australia, but also thinking about it in Canada, Hong Kong, I've never done consultancy into the US. In all of those places, it's very easy and totally understandable that policymakers try to simplify things because it's a hell of a complex environment they're trying to deal with. And one of those simplifications is to only listen to not just the loud voices, but to the loud voices that carry power of some kind with them. And to a policymaker, the big issue with power is, could these guys block the effectiveness? Could they kill this whole policy initiative stone dead? Or could they prevent it being implemented effectively, e.g. by staying away, by not adopting the new technology, various ways in which various kinds of stakeholders can have power. Now, that's a very unsatisfactory position to have that accepted as the norm. So what we've got to do is find ways to change that for the benefits, for the benefit of all of the many different segments that have interests that need to be reflected. And one of the ways to do that, I believe, is to get stakeholder theory and the various techniques that are used and in some cases should be used and aren't yet in public policy discourse, to get them outside business school thinking, which is too narrow. It's got its place, but it's too narrow for these purposes. Get it into an instrumentalist social science, or better still, dare we use that horrible word, social engineering context, because that's what we've got to have. Effective techniques available to public servants, which will guide them into reflecting the interests of the various publics. Sorry, it wasn't a question.
No, I was just going to treat it another way. One of the results of the trends that I've been seeing in terms of community average level of education, and I am not underwriting the quality of that, I'm simply saying the average level has risen, is that we're getting higher order questions raised at the political level. And I think that in the last few weeks, we've seen it. The clear and consistent policy of most of the TILs in saying, we want trust, is not a formulation you would have heard 20 years ago. And that's very much a community one, and it brought huge on-the-ground support. So we have the opportunity from the higher levels of information flow and from the higher average levels of community to actually work at a higher level in community engagement. And I find that most encouraging single thing from the last election. I mean, apart from the, I mean, if the guy had been re-elected, that's, forget it. But the positive aspect was that 10 people were elected on a clear basis of trust and transparency and accountability. This may be what politicians are supposed to do, but it sure as hell isn't what they do. And this time, they've been elected with very large on-the-ground support for those specific things, which is a higher order kind of commentary, which suggests that we could, with coherent cooperation, have the kind of effect that Keating had. If any of you remember Keating, people were able to discuss some economic concepts correctly as a result of his efforts. We're now in a situation where we can discuss accountability and trust efforts and have it understood. So it's not lost. It's simply that the formulation of what we need isn't being done by government, schools of government and schools of business. It really needs to be schools of government, Steve, not schools of business. I'm just being quite clear.
Well, I would argue stakeholder analysis is just a tool. It's how you use that tool and how you weight the different legitimacy versus power issues. Ultimately, Roger and Marcus, it's an issue of rationing, of, you know, how do you ration attention of bureaucrats? And currently the currency is power. We pay attention to those that have influence over us, whether that's monetary or other forms of influence.
Yes, hence the couple of comments I made about public interest advocates have got to get some ticker. They've got to get together. They've got to become much more activist and communicate what the rules of the game should be compared to what they are. Can I just add one thing in supporting what you were saying, Marcus, but can I just reframe it slightly? The word trust I've been trying to shift to one side for some years. The focus needs to be on trustworthiness. Get the idea away from the state of mind of the people, because that can be manipulated too easily. Politics is about doing that. We've got to get the focus on the organizations who should be able to be trusted. And that, of course, means trustworthiness is a word. And then I think we've got a much better chance of having a debate about what differences there need to be in the patterns of behaviour of those organisations, and indeed the patterns of behaviour of the ministers and the parties that are sitting above and shaping what the public servants are doing.
Trustworthiness is when you have people you can trust. So I have no disagreement with your rephrasing. But this is the end of our time, I believe. So I'm actually trying to put together a book. I was going to do a PhD in this, but there isn't a single university that wants to take me on as a PhD student. You may decide for yourself what the reasons are, but they certainly don't. I don't think it's quite as simple as antique, but it is actually quite alarming. And the reason that I'll close on it is because when I started, I raised this question in a discussion with Pierre Andrews, and I thought, well, I'll go and test this. And I tested it with a recently retired deputy secretary who'd actually run several departments, and also with a local Victorian minister. The responses were identical. I was given twice the time I asked for. We were told, is there anything, whatever I can do to accelerate this? Do you want any pressure on a university to take you on, or whatever, because we need this badly? And yet the universities don't want to know, which I find very interesting. The questions apparently raise some insecurities amongst, I don't know why, but it's consistent. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm afraid we're out of time for today's session. So many points, I think, to reflect on moving forward, and I hope that we can continue these discussions. My co-host, Katina Michael, and I would like to thank you, Professor Marcus Wigan, for joining us today and for opening our 4th series of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium. Thank you yet again to Melissa Waite and the events team, and also to our live attendees. Thank you so much for attending. And in closing, I would like to note that we've provided Marcus's email address if you'd like to continue these discussions offline. And we'd like to also issue a reminder that the recording for this session will be available on the School for the Future of Innovation in Society's YouTube channel, in addition to IEEE TV. And we wish you all a lovely day and look forward to seeing you in the next session of the PIT Colloquium. Thanks again, Professor Marcus Wigan.
Cheers.